looks like we are set. Let me just go grab my water bottle real quick. All right, well, hello everybody. Happy Thursday. Today is the second Thursday of the month, which could only mean one thing. We have our intermediate camera knowledge. So first and foremost, thanks to everybody who's joining my classes. We do this every month. We do each week as long as there are 4 Thursdays in a month, which there typically are. But we do the first, the second, the third, and the final Thursday of every month. Now the goal is always to teach you guys something a little bit new or to give you some insight into the camera world. Today's intermediate class is really going to kind of jump off from where we were last week. So for those of you who joined last week, it was the intro class. In the intro to cameras class, we talked about the kind of bare bones, right? We wanted to keep everything simple, not too complex. So we talk about our entry level settings, our what's the term I'm looking for? Auto mode. Staying in automatic, learning where the buttons are on your cameras, understanding lenses a little bit better and how those function. From there, then, we broke into just a little bit more general terminology. But the idea behind that class was to get you guys up and running so that you guys could use your camera now that you've just purchased one, or just so you know how to use it when you did purchase one. Intermediate, though, we want to graduate. Now is where we want to take the time to become more technical. We want to learn the foundation of the camera a little bit better. So we're going to learn more of the manual controls. We're going to go from taking our camera as a kind of just auto-functioning thing, and we're going to use the advanced settings on there, the manual control, to use it as a tool, to manipulate the camera to get what we want. And I have an example of what I call that. So why do we want to go more advanced on the point-and-shoot DSLR or mirrorless cameras? And the fact is, to be as simple as possible, we want it to be better. There's something that we're not getting out of our image. We've already upgraded from our cell phones, and we're moving into something that is now more complicated, something we have to learn the process of. But these cameras are meant to have these settings on there so we can manipulate and get the best photo possible. Not knowing where those settings are or what they do is absolutely fine. This is a starting point. This is the entry into the whole, how cameras function. So the goal is now to learn. There's a few different things that we're going to be learning today. But one of the big key differences is what is the difference between a snapshot and a photograph. This is the starting point. A snapshot is meant to be a quick picture. This was a snapshot that I took of the escalator as you're heading up to our furniture department. Automatic setting, not a lot thought out with it. Click, point, and shoot the camera. Whereas with this one, we've actually taken the time to take a real photograph. So using the settings on the camera to manipulate the camera in such a way where I can control certain aspects. When moving from the automatic settings into manual control, you're going to be able to control the photo, manipulate things on the camera. Therefore, you should be able to take something like this, which is clean, easy, simple, if you want to tell your friends maybe where you're at or what you're looking at, to then actually manipulating things like the aperture, the f-stop, the shutter, the ISO. Taking all of these into account and manipulating them so you can get something that is a little bit more like this. That's your main goal. And that's what we're going to be working on in the class today. Keep it simple. Step 1, remember, learn your camera. Everyone's camera is a little bit different. Everyone functions a little bit differently. So it's important to take your time, read the manual, study your camera, watch some YouTube clips, learn about your particular model. So that way you know where everything's located on there, you know how to find it the fastest. And when there are things to change, or manipulate, or get to, you might not know how that works or how that functions, but you at least know where to find that in your camera's settings. Now, really what we're paying attention to as we talk about these more advanced settings is the mode dial. The mode dial, like I talked about last week, is like your gear shift in your car. Playing with the mode dial is going to, like with your car, change your vehicle from drive, neutral, reverse, park. This is going to do the same thing. As you turn this dial, it's going to control the settings of the camera so that it fires the way that you want it to. Whether that be manual, automatic, shutter, program automatic, and so on and so forth. The next steps that you should be looking at. Automatic should be the one that we talked about last week. It's the entry, it's the beginning part. Once you feel comfortable with automatic, I'd recommend Program Auto, which does something very similar. Everything that Auto does, Program does. The only big difference with this is that you can manipulate some aspects of Program Auto. And really what we're talking about today is the aperture priority, the shutter priority, and full manual. Aperture and shutter both work independently of each other when you're on their priority modes. But when you go to full manual, they all work together and they mingle. ISO fits into there too, so what I'd like to spend the majority of this class doing today is going through each of the different ones: aperture priority, shutter priority, and full manual control, shutter priority, aperture, and then ISO. We're going to talk about what that means, how that works, how they function independently, and then I'll talk a little bit about how they all come together. We're going to, at the very end, look at some photos, and then I'm going to tell you what I see and what I would think that the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter would be. And from there, if anyone has any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to live chat and chime in at any point in time. I'll answer your questions live as long as they're appropriate. When we talk about all those different things, aperture, shutter, and ISO, we can refer to them as a chart or as a triangle. I personally like the chart better because I think that it manipulates and shows things on a nice little scale. However, the triangle is nice too because it does something similar. Aperture, shutter, and ISO are the three parts of photography that mix together to give us the final image that we see. Each one controls something a little bit different than the other, and the idea of this class right now is to learn what each one of them does separately, and then again, how they all come together. If we start with aperture, it's the beginning kind of standard point that we all learn in photography because it is written on our lenses, and aperture becomes a very important thing as you kind of keep moving forward. Aperture is all about two things. Number one is the foreground to background separation and how you're separating those two. And the second aspect of it is how much light is coming in. The larger the number in aperture, the smaller the diameter of that aperture is. So if you look at f22, the circle on the left-hand side of it shows a small white circle surrounded by gray. Is video quality educate on shooting? Thank you. It is a webcam that we are using on this one, not one of the higher definition cameras. Again, idea with this is just to give you guys some information on shooting both regular cameras, cinematic cameras, or film cameras, whatever it is that you're working with. But thank you for that. So with aperture, that's what we're looking at, right? It's the background to foreground separation, how much light we're letting in. At f1.4, you can see that that diameter of the circle on the left-hand side of the number is completely open. So right off the bat, you can tell that between f22 and f1.4, one is more open than the other. Meaning that at f1.4, we're letting the most amount of light in, where at f22, because of its smaller hole in diameter, we're only letting a little bit of light in. Now, where the background to foreground separation comes in is with the picture above those numbers and circles. If you look at f22, you can clearly see the stick figure standing in front of a pyramid. If you look at f1.4, you no longer can see the pyramid, but you do see the person. At f22, though we might not be wide open, letting a lot of light into the camera, we are getting both the foreground and the background into the same picture. At f1.4, we're not getting the background, but we're just focusing in on our subject matter. So not only does the aperture refer to how much light comes into the camera, but it also refers to the subject matter and what's in front of us. With something like an f22, we're getting the entirety of the photo, both foreground and background. With 1.4, we're not getting that much information, just the foreground. Everything else in between does something similar or different from that. And the reason that there is such this larger number is because as you adjust and you make exceptions on your camera, things are going to change, and therefore there is this kind of, what's the term I'm looking for? There's a scale for aperture, because not one time that you shoot will be the same as the next time that you shoot. Unless you're in a controlled studio environment, things change, lighting changes, settings change, and composition changes. Therefore, this aperture chart kind of gives you the perspective of using all the numbers when it might be the most beneficial. Some pictures I have to go along with that. If we look at the picture on the left of the dog's noses, or the dogs, we can see the dog's nose in the foreground there. It's in complete clarity. We can see the nose. The dog behind, though, is not as focused, is not as clean. It's blurred. If we look at our chart, that's probably somewhere between an f5.6 and an f4. You can tell that there's still a pyramid behind the stick figure, yet you can't make out the finer details of the pyramid. And I'd say the same thing is for this one. You look at the dog's nose, you can see that. You can tell that's a dog behind the dog. However, you can't make out its details completely clear. With the squirrel, on the other hand, the squirrel and part of that branch are in perfect focus, yet the background is almost completely blurred out. The green should give nice clarity that that's probably a tree or a bush of some kind, but again, we can't make out all the finer details. If we look at the chart, then we're probably sitting somewhere at an f1.4 and f2. We're letting a lot of light into the camera, yet we can't make out what's behind our figure. And in this case, we can't really make out what's behind the squirrel. Now, I talked about f-stop not only equating to background to foreground separation, but how much light comes in. And I think this picture does a really good job. If you look at the deep side, you can see all the way to the back of the photo. The trees, the bushes, the branches, the leaves, and the dog. And if you look at the shallow side, you're only seeing the dog, and everything else has a blur to it. But if you look closely at the dog, you can see the light. On the deep side, the dog is dark, and there's a lot of shadows and overcast. On the left-hand side, the dog has a lighter quality to it. The fur is a little bit more easy to see. And this is, again, because of light, because of how we're now manipulating the light that's coming into the camera. When we're using something like an f22, we're closing the lens off to light. Therefore, things will get darker if we don't adjust our settings. On the shallow side, it's kind of the opposite. The lighter everything will become, but the more blurred out the background to the foreground separation happens. Depending on the way that you're shooting, if you're shooting in the aperture priority mode, your camera will do the rest of the heavy lifting, adjusting the others. So adjusting ISO and adjusting the shutter speed. But if you're controlling it all together, that's something to keep in mind. Why use aperture priority mode? This, I think, is a great picture. If you're on vacation and you, the family, the kids, the wife, the husband are all, enjoying yourselves, you go in front of, let's say you went to, Rome and you're in front of the Colosseum. You probably want to get a picture of the kids or the family in front of the Colosseum because that is the cool thing to do. Now, you might be somewhere else and you want to just get a nice headshot of the kids, the wife, the mister, whoever it is. Instead of keeping the background in focus, you might want to blur that out and just focus in on that portrait. Priority mode for aperture would be a great option for this because the camera will do the heavy lifting as far as shutter speed and as far as ISO go. You're controlling how much of the background and the foreground that you see and how much light you're letting in through the lens. Aperture priority mode gives you the flexibility If this background wasn't as pretty as it was, you might not want to take a picture like this at all. You might just want to take a picture of the person standing there. However, with how beautiful the background is, how much light is coming through, they've adjusted so that way they get both the foreground and the background in the entirety of the shot, and it's crisp and clear. So this would be a great time to use aperture priority. Now shutter speed. It's a little bit different, but similar. Shutter speed is referring to how fast the shutters are closing on your camera. The faster the speed is, the better for moving objects. So 1 500th of a second is fast. The slower things are, the more detail it'll bring into the camera, but if that object's moving or in motion, you're most likely going to get a blurry image. So with the speed that this stick figure is running, at half a second, it's very blurry. Even at 1/30th or 1/60th of a second, you have blur. But between the 125 and 1/500ths, it's not necessarily that blurry, meaning that we're freezing the image in motion. When we have high octane or fast movement, cars, surfers, if you've got children or friends who are athletes, baseball, track, cross country, anything where there's speed involved, freezing action typically comes at about 1 1,000th or faster. Reason being is that the object's moving so quickly that in order to freeze it, we got to use a fast speed. Now, keeping this in mind, though, it's not necessarily a bad thing to get motion or blur within our images. Obviously, the goal is always to take a picture and have it in perfect still frame. However, a little bit of blur goes a long way, and this I think is a nice photo to show that off. You have the bird here that's flying. You can see the beautiful colors within the bird's feathers, the yellows, the blues, the greens, the umber browns, the orange or redness of the beak. The wings have a little bit of blur. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing because it shows a sense of motion. We know that this bird isn't a stuffed bird. This isn't like you're at a science and industry museum or a natural history museum. You are seeing a bird fly in the air, catching a bug in its beak. The wings have a little bit of blur, but the color of the bird and that kind of substantial pop is apparent. So don't be afraid of motion, don't be afraid of blur. It doesn't necessarily always help the photo, but in this case, I don't think that it's detracting at all. On the flip side of using shutter priority to get faster images, you can also use shutter priority to create long exposure. Long exposure creates mood, creates saturation, helps push colors a little bit further within our photos. If you look at this image here, you can see the path and the travel of the water, how the water's falling at a consistent rate and current in certain areas. But if you look at the greens, the brick, the moss, you can really see the vibrancy and the pop of color. This camera would have probably sat on a tripod, could have been there for 6 to 15 seconds depending on the shooter. But you can see the detail in the image because it was kept open for this long and it wasn't disturbed. So not only can you use shutter priority or shutter to get images quick, you can also use them to take long exposures, things that are not quick. Now, again, aperture priority did something where not only are you focusing on the foreground to background relationship, blurring out what you don't need, keeping what you do, but by setting aperture, you can make a photo lighter or darker. Shutter speed is very similar. The longer that the shutter stays open, the more light comes in. The faster the shutter closes, the darker things become. On the flip side of that though, the slower you go and the more that the object you're taking a photo is in motion, the blurrier it'll become. The faster someone's moving and the faster that you shoot, the better chance you have to freeze that motion. But now there's the give and take. So, When you're using shutter priority, it's nice because all you have to do is focus on the speed. The camera will do the rest of the heavy lifting for you and give you the proper aperture and ISO to help boost whatever it is you're doing on this. And to sum it all up, why use shutter priority? And I like this photo a lot. I had a customer send this to me. They were annoyed. They didn't know what they were doing wrong on their camera. And it comes down to motion. You might end up going to an event or be taking photos of something and there's motion that's happening. My recommendation is with shutter priority to shoot a few times and measure the speed. If your images are coming out crisp and there's no blur to it and you're getting good shots, even if they're not necessarily right off the bat what you wanted, but dialing in your camera to make sure whatever event that you're at, you've got the correct speed. You might have to adjust the speed a couple different times. And if the things you're taking photos of are primarily going to be in motion, in this case we had an ultimate frisbee game, then you're probably going to benefit from using something like shutter priority. Now, one of the last things to talk about before we talk about bringing it all together is ISO. So ISO is going to be the way that we control the sensitivity of light into our camera. Where this matters is in the manual control when you're using things like shutter and aperture. You're adjusting how much information you want in your photo, background to foreground separation with aperture. That also dictates how much light comes in. That then typically means you need to adjust your shutter to either freeze the motion because they're moving quickly or to bring in more light or color into the camera based on the speed you then have your shutter at. The third thing that then gets changed to help you with both of those is your ISO. And this changes the sensitivity towards light. If you're shooting darker or shooting things that are faster, they're naturally going to make the camera take in less light. Your camera's sensor can then be tuned to whatever ISO that you'd prefer to help it then be more sensitive towards the available light it has. So again, in this case, 1 to 800, you can see that it's the same shutter and aperture, but the ISO changes from square to square. And you can see how much lighter and vibrant it goes from 100 to 800. In a similar slide, ISO 100, you barely can see anything. But at 1600, not only do you see the rainbow, but you can see what looks to be water and a shoreline or rock line, a street lamp that's in the distance, and two people who are standing there. Now again, similar to things like our aperture and shutter, they're all adjustable and they all have a scale that they go on because there is no one right answer. You might have to have a very high aperture because you have to keep both the background and the foreground in focus. But your lighting isn't that consistent, so you're changing ISO and the object's not moving, so shutter doesn't really matter. You just can't go too slow, otherwise you'll get blur. There's a lot of aspects to this. So with ISO, it's no different. When you're using ISO, if you use too much, mirrorless cameras are nice. In the future, today's cameras, usually the screen will go extremely white, showing you that it's washed out. The ISO is too strong, and the color and the lighting are just too much. So it'll give you a white image. And if it's too low of ISO, it typically will black the screen out too much. For those who shoot on DSLR or still are shooting with ISO and they're not noticing that with the screen, what you might then notice is what we call noise. When you hit the image playback and you go to take a look at the photo, you might have noise on the image. And typically noise comes from the fact that we've set our camera to too high of an ISO within a bright light or space. And this is a good example of it. At ISO 100, it's nighttime, it looks like sunset. That looks to be one of the Chrysler Tower or the one for Empire State Building from New York. But you can see that at 100 it's fine, but at 3200 we have noise. And that's because there's too much light in this photo. our camera's set too high, so it's going to result in some noise within our image. So adjusting ISO appropriately for the lighting and the conditions that you're in. And if you don't feel comfortable doing something like that, or you don't know how to do that, auto ISO exists. And I do like auto ISO, and I stand by it, because I think it's a really good thing or an easy thing to use. Now, I had a few people who've asked me before, what's the best time to use automatic ISO? And I usually tell them, depending on when you're shooting, I get people who do events, and they're shooting both indoor, outdoor. They don't really have time to manipulate all of the settings on their camera. They're typically focused on the aperture and the shutter. ISO adds another level of complexity to it. So I usually get asked what I recommend, and I think auto ISO would be a great time to use that. Letting the ISO automatically adjust based on the lighting conditions and how much light is available is never a bad idea. If there's a certain number or texture you want to deal with, sometimes setting ISOs to whatever it is that you might want it to be is a good option to get the style or quality of photo that you're looking for. But I will say that automatic ISO on these new mirrorless cameras is fantastic. It does a lot of heavy lifting, and it gives you, the photographer, the time to focus on composition, aperture, shutter, and maybe some other settings that you're more fond of. I say fond of, maybe more settings that you're concerned about changing as you're shooting. Reviewing it again, we start with aperture, f16 to f1.4. The difference between that is that at f16, we're keeping both the background, which is the couch, and then the foreground, which is the little pigs, in focus. As we jump down to 1.4, we're blurring out the background and just focusing in on our subject matter, which is the little pigs. Going from there, we then have our shutter. Our shutter is going to dictate how fast the shutters open and close. Therefore, the faster we set our shutter, the faster it'll close, but the better chance we have to doing a freeze frame. The slower we go, the more atmosphere, the more mood we pull into it, the more saturation color we get. But if the object's moving, we're going to see motion blur. And finally, ISO. ISO, the lower the number, the less sensitive towards light the camera is. The higher the number, the more sensitivity the camera has towards light. Too high of sensitivity and we can get noise and a washed out image. Too low of sensitivity and we don't collect enough information. All three of these work independently of each other, and that is the shutter priority, the aperture priority, and or setting automatic ISO or non-automatic ISO. The control over both the aperture and the shutter is the full manual control. So if you go to the M on your camera, you can always set ISO to be auto, but then you would control aperture and shutter together. And again, where shutter priority and aperture priority are great learning tools for people who might be trying to get into full manual, I would strongly recommend practicing with those first. So again, if you're coming from automatic and you were at my last week's class and you're familiar with that, experiment with the aperture. Experiment with the ISO priority only. Play with that. I'm a big fan of aperture priority and being able to dictate the foreground to background relationship that I have. Every once in a while I'm in an environment where there's speed or movement, so I might need to just do shutter priority as well, and that'll help with the capturing and freeze frame. But again, full manual, now you're controlling both. Aperture and shutter play off of each other, and you get to use that larger scale in order to figure out the best settings to take your picture. It might seem complicated, but with time and practice, both of these will make sense on their own. And then when you're manipulating the camera on manual, they make sense together once you get to that point. Now some other things to look at. Let's start with the exposure. So let's say that you are on full manual. You've played with things like your shutter, your aperture, your ISO, but the camera still feels dark or too light. You have what's called the exposure meter, and you have what's called exposure compensation. Exposure compensation lets you go onto one side or the other side of the scale, positive numbers or negative numbers, and you will raise or lower the darkness of your photo. This is what we call the exposure. If you've already set everything on your camera and you just feel like it's still not enough, this is usually the second thing that you then change. You've changed your ISO, you've made your shutter and aperture are at the correct speeds to get you what you need, but now you need a little more oomph or a little less oomph. This is where setting the exposure meter might be another good option. Light metering. So light metering takes the measurement of light. So when we look at the camera's sensor, that is what's measuring light in front of us. That's what's giving us the various different numbers and readings for how we set our camera. Almost all cameras have the same kind of setup, but some do it a little bit differently. Again, three main ones to look at for light metering. This is how we change the sensitivity of light on the camera, giving us more of a, what's the term I'm looking for? More sensitivity, less sensitivity, or more centralized sensitivity. So for example, multi. It's going to look at lights from all different points of our camera's sensor. So not just the middle, not just the sides, but the entirety of it. Center looks at the light that's coming from the middle and what's radiating off of it. So I like to think of a candle. If you light a candle in the middle of a dark room, you'll see the candle's flame, but then you'll see light as it radiates and flickers and changes because the light from the flame is dancing and moving as well. And spot will only go from the center portion. So if you take that color or that light that's radiating from the candle, and now you centralize it to just the flame and nothing else around it, that's what center or spot's going to do. On the flip side, you've got entire screen average and partial. They're going to do something similar, but what they're doing is taking the mathematical equation of how much light is around this whole sensor and bringing the whole sensor's average to that. It's kind of a cool feature, something to play with, but depending on the manufacturer, you're going to see that they have different forms of light metering. Some people will just keep it at the matrix or multi or evaluative. Other people will change it. It really is more of a personal preference, but it's fun and it'll definitely do something unique and different to your photos. So definitely worth trying out and practicing or playing with. Now, one of the last things I'll talk about before we then look at some images and I tell you what I'm seeing, but it's white balance. Now, the way to look at this is that the color white exists in nearly everything that we look at, unless we're looking at a pitch black color. Those two then live at the opposite sides of the spectrum. But if you were to look at, anything, white will exist in there some way, shape, or form. Because of that, there is a balance to it. White is a very easily manipulated color. When you have light and various factors that hit white, it changes the tonality of white. Makes it hot or cold, alive or dead. If you look at the lower side of the Kelvin scale, we can see that it's red. It's more of sodium vapor, incandescent lighting. And when we look at something in the higher section of Kelvin, it's shade, it's daylight fluorescent, cloudy. The reason being is that the sun dictates how we see things. Shade dictates how we see things. Clouds dictate how we see. So with that being said, on our camera, we can always keep it at automatic. It's the fail-safe, it's the easiest one to choose. But from there, we can customize our camera's balance of the color white to fit the situation we're in. If we're in a darker place, something that might have more shade, we can then set it to a shade or incandescent setting. If we're somewhere where we have fluorescent or incandescent lights, we should be able to move that closer towards a direct sunlight or a standard fluorescent. Your camera can do a couple different things. They usually have presets like what you see on the left-hand side of the chart. They might also just have it with the color temperature where you can update and change. Take a look at your camera, see what settings that they have for controlling that. But experiment. Take your camera off auto for a little bit and then play around with the various different color settings to see how light is manipulated and shifted through just the color white. Now, let's look at some images and see what settings they use. This is the part of the class where I'm going to just show some images to everybody here. And what I'm going to then do is explain the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO. And I might talk a little bit about why I see that being those numbers. You guys can chime in or chat if you have any questions from there. But really what I'm looking at is, if I were to put myself in the eyes or in the shoes of the photographer, and I'm looking at their final image, how would I guess that they shot? If I'm going out in the field and I see this in front of me, these are the settings that I would change my camera to in order to get the photo I see ahead of me. And I'm only looking at 3 settings: ISO, f-stop or aperture, and then the shutter. So, we have a landscape photo, we've got some architecture in there, a bridge, a vanishing point, and one singular dot that leads all the way down the photo. We can see that it looks to be nighttime in this photo. The lights are extremely bright, and there is some noise that's coming from underneath the pillars. So my theory is that ISO is very high. I would probably say about 3200, maybe 1600. And again, only because I see the noise in the darker parts of the photo. Shutter is probably going to move at a slower rate because nothing's really moving in this image. We want to bring in more light into the camera. That's why I have ISO turned up. So for shutter, I probably say it's at 1/50th of a second. Be a little slower than that, 1/30th. But depending on if they're using a tripod or not, again, they might need to go a little bit quicker. And as far as aperture is concerned, the reason that I think that the ISO and the aperture or the shutter are where they're at is because of the aperture. And I think that that's closer to an f2.22. And the reason being is that when you look at it, you can see both the foreground and the background in focus. Obviously, as you look straight down the image, you start to lose that focus. But just from the kind of front end of the photo, you see both of those. Here we have some cherry blossoms. We can clearly see that it's a bright sunny day. There is blue skies behind all these plants. So with that being said, I think ISO is probably going to be low, 100 to 400 at the max. Aperture is definitely going to be a little bit more on the blurring of the background side. So aperture is probably closer to a 5.64. You can see that the background is more cherry blossoms, but you can't see the finer details of those cherry blossoms. And shutter speed, unless there's a lot of movement or the wind was strong during this, I'd say 1/250th of a second or slower. Again, not too slow because we are standing probably taking this photo. So any slower than I'd say about 1/60th or 1/50th of a second, then you're probably getting into shake territory if you were to take the photo without a tripod. Here we have the fireman, one fireman in front of the other. The fireman behind is completely blurred out. You can tell that it's the same another fireman because you can see the walkie-talkie, the helmet, the jacket comes up to the head. We have those details, but we can't make out the finer details of the other fireman behind him. Are his eyes looking at us, the camera? Are his eyes looking at the back of his other fireman's head? So in this case, I would say that the aperture here is closer to that maybe 2.8, maybe a 4, but probably lower than that. So I'll stay at 2.8, a little lower, maybe 2. From there then, ISO, you've got some orange lighting that's coming in here, so it is a lower Kelvin scale, probably something closer to the 3,000 or 4,000 range, maybe a little lower than that. But that being said, ISO is probably somewhere at 800, maybe a little higher at 16, and that's only to make up for how kind of rich that color and that light is. And as far as shutter is concerned, this is where it gets tricky. If these guys are moving, then it could be faster. It could be 400ths of a second, 500ths of a second. I truly doubt that though. I'd probably put this at 1/250th or 1/125th of a second. Those numbers are typically fast, but in the grand scheme of things, if 1/1000th of a second is to capture fast motion, then 1/125th, 1/60th, 1/250th of a second, those are fast, but they're not that fast comparatively. Here we have the ram's head, or the ram. Here you can see the detail, the color, the quality of the fur on this guy, how detailed the horns are. So this is an up close, almost a macro style shot. Aperture is first. I would say that the aperture is somewhere around a 5.6 to an 8 because you can tell that behind this guy is shrub or like branches, snow, a tree, but you can't make out the finer details. There is a slight blur. ISO, because of how moody this image is, I probably would say ISO is at a 200, maybe a 400 at the most. And now this is where I get a little confused with the shutter. So I have a feeling that this is a picture that you probably would have taken at a natural history museum, somewhere where they have the animals and stuffed animals to see the taxidermy animals. So if that's the case, I can't imagine this guy's moving. So 1/60th to 125th of a second, I think is reasonable because of how much detail is on this. If you've ever heard of rams or goats, they tend to headbutt you if you're too close or if you've been standing there for too long. So that's my theory for this guy. Or it's a really, really passive ram. Here we've got some dogs that are flying through the air. So this is a perfect example of someone using a 1 in 1,000th or faster shutter. Aperture is wide open to make up for how fast the shutter is. And you can see that by how blurred the background is and how much focus is on the dogs. So 1.2, 1.4, that's what we're definitely looking at for an aperture. And now as far as the ISO, lighting is good, but because of how fast the speed on this camera is, we might have to bump the ISO up a little bit. Faster shutter, wide open aperture, possibly a heavy ISO. I would say 800 at the most for something like this, but possibly 200, maybe 1, but I think that's too low. So I would say between 200 and 200 and 800 for the ISO for how fast the shutter would have to go to capture these dogs and freeze. And one of the last ones I have is the gentleman scoring a touchdown. He's obviously broken 2 tackle guys behind him. He's jumping into the end zone. We can clearly tell that he evaded 2 people, but we can't make the finer details of him too much. We can tell that's player number 6. We can tell the guys on the floor. I would put this aperture at about an 8. It's a little bit higher. Speed I'm going to put high, at probably 1 in 1,000th or greater, only because you can see the turf pebbles as they fly through the air. This is a diving touchdown. And on top of that, ISO is probably somewhere in that 800 or maybe to 200 range again. A lot of sunlight coming from above. We can see the drop shadows on the players. However, because that shutter is so much higher, we have to overcompensate with ISO. So that's where my 800 to 200 range would come. If this guy's sprinting for his life to get into the touchdown zone, we're probably putting our numbers at a higher rate to overcompensate for the speed that our shutter's going at. Learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. Guys, I have customers and friends and people who come to me every few months to ask me the same couple questions. And it's because they've learned, they can learn it, they don't practice, and they don't go out and they don't do the things that we're talking about on a regular basis. Doesn't mean today, doesn't mean tomorrow, but take time once or twice a week, or really anytime you can, and play with your camera. Experiment with the settings. Play with different features on there. If something gets screwed up, worst case scenario, you can always factory data reset your camera and reboot it back to normal, but practicing with the product goes a long way. And learning how to manipulate the different settings and control them, being comfortable to do so when you're not at home or you're not in front of me or another person who's a big camera guy is huge. So practice. Get out there, use your camera, and do things with it. My best accessories that cost little to nothing would be practicing, obviously. Classes. I teach a free class here. There are other groups, organizations, clubs, classes that meet that don't cost anything too. And if you are looking to spend a little bit money, there are some great instructors out there who charge a great rate for you to get a knowledge or an education within the cameras that you might be desperately needing. YouTube is probably one of the greatest resources out there for camera professionals. I used to say masterclass, but again, things have changed since COVID and that time. But YouTube has thousands upon thousands, maybe even millions of videos, and so many people talk about different cameras and models. You can easily get on there and learn so much about the model that you have and how it works and functions. Workshops fall under classes. If you can get into one of those, it's fantastic. And then travel. If you leave and go anywhere for any reason and you don't bring your camera with you, then shame on you. Because if you don't, then you're just not going to get the practice that you probably need. And what better time to practice than when you're out and about traveling and doing other things. If you need to buy something, I usually recommend buy the top 5 things I have listed. Get a bag, protect your equipment, you spent a lot of money on it. An extra battery or an extra memory card go a long way. It's always good to double up on those. Get yourself a lens cleaning kit. Don't use your t-shirt or your sweatshirt to clean the lenses. Get a camera strap, something that loops around the camera so that it's firm, it's protected, it's around your neck. Tripods are great if you need stabilization. External hard drives are great to save your images to. Filters, polarizing, ND filters, and then also additional lenses. Especially now that we're getting more intermediate, you might be realizing that the lens you have doesn't do what you need it to do. It might be a good idea to look to upgrade. It might also be good to look at an additional lens to meet the other needs that you have. And that's all I have for you guys. So next month, or next week, is our advanced camera class. We're going to do that the next Thursday. So just for everybody watching at home, that is going to be on the 18th. So December 18th, we are going to do our advanced cameras. Guys, I'll sit here for a little bit longer. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to chat. I'll answer those live. If you don't, I'll probably leave in the next 4 or 5 minutes. It doesn't look like anybody has any questions for me as of now. Again, don't worry about it. If you want to email or call me or just reach out to Apple Electronics and ask for the small electronics department, myself or any of my other colleagues can assist with any questions that you have. My name is Saxon. I teach the camera classes on Thursdays. We do this from 5:30 to 7. We'll be doing it next Thursday, December 18th, for our advanced cameras. So if you got time, please come out for that. As always, everybody, thank you. Enjoy your holidays. Merry Christmas, and keep on shooting. I'll see you guys.